you know, this is a very interesting case. It's not a case of regulation at all. It's a case of what, at least arguably, is subsidization. And I guess the piece I'd like to hear more about is how are you pricing the use of your facility? Are you going to recover the state's investment? Are you going to make a return on the investment? And that's the point at which I guess the two of you find yourselves on opposite sides.
So our business model is to recover sufficient costs to cover the operation of the network, but to not repay the 40 million, up to 40 million in state bond funds. So in the same way that the state would invest in roads or sewer, and through increased tax receipts and everything, that as businesses expand.
We invest in sewers, those get paid back.
Yeah, but the model around what we're doing, at least, is that we are not anticipating that we are going to, if it was possible for someone to go out and borrow the money in the capital markets and make a return sufficient to repay the interest, Verizon or others could do it. The whole problem is that you can't go out and borrow the money and make a sufficient return because of the low population density, because of the geographic challenges. So I don't know if the model is like rural electrification, but it is, I think it's a sound investment. And I think there are lots of ways in which, when we were doing the legislative hearings, where Sharon Gillette and other economists would sort of go in and sort of show all the demonstrated, the uptick in employment and tax receipts and income, wages that result from communities with broadband versus those without. So those do accrue to the state, but it's not like we are repaying a particular line item on those on that bond funding. And the Recovery Act money, the $7.2 billion is being put out federally. That is half of that is, I think, grant RUS program, which is half is loan.
If I can just play devil's advocate for one more second, and one could certainly argue that what we're really doing with our tax dollars is subsidizing Verizon and the other providers who are now going to be able to reap profits by connecting onto the backbone at less than its real cost.
Well, I think it's a fair point. I will say that given the opposition that I experience and I've seen around the federal government's intervention, I don't think the incumbents view this as a gift to them. And if our middle mile network is open access, which is required to be by federal law, Verizon can ride that network subject to the same constraints as anyone else. And so it means that, yes, Verizon may choose to ride the network, but they're not guaranteed a monopoly on that. And so that puts price constraints and others on it. I know that Open Cape is something in Cape Cod and the Islands where that was a more controversial project because it's served in many ways, so it's considered underserved versus unserved. And I know Comcast, which was one of the arguments that they made was, look, you're using public tax dollar to come in and create a network that's going to compete against us, and this is a level playing field. So I'm not going to speak for Verizon, but I know that Comcast did not view this as a subsidy model. They viewed it as using public tax dollars in a way that was going to compete with them unfairly.
There's also an argument to be made, though. There's a fine balance because there's a public good, I think, in what the state is investing in. If you look at those countries that were on the slides that have incredible capacity with their internet, a lot of them made public investments to make this possible. And if you look at the students that come from these countries, their capacity, their technological expertise is far advanced than some of our students. Now, that's not to suggest the infrastructure is the only reason for that. I mean, I'm sure the educational investment as well, but these kids are coming with much more technological capacity than our kids have because their countries, especially India, which I'm surprised you didn't have India on the slide, their computer skills and their technology skills are far advanced in comparison to our students.
Certain areas of India. There are other areas.
Certain areas, yeah. That's right. You're right. Certain areas in India, yeah. So there's a public good with regards to that I think that the state of Massachusetts is trying to make to inspire the private sector to be able to come on board with it. But for us as a public, I think the general public good, for something like this, I think is an important investment.
Right. I mean, the cost benefit analysis, I think it's a fair question you're asking, but I remember when we were developing the initiative, I came across a case in Iowa where there was a mother who had been had a head trauma in a car accident, and it was a rural setting. The hospital did an MRI or CT scan, had a slow connection, was uploading it to a regional research hospital. The moment it came through, the neurologist sort of immediately called and said, "You've got to release pressure on the skull." The woman had expired 15 minutes prior. It was all due to the fact that it had taken an hour for something like that to upload. And Blue Mask Group is a blog that some people here may be familiar with. It's surprising. The Broadband initiative is not universally popular among that group because there's a prevailing view among many if you want to have broadband, live in an area that has it. And it's really interesting when I think about people who rely upon broadband. I mean, Blue Mask Group bloggers are constantly online. If you turned off their internet, they would scream bloody murder. And yet, the idea that there are people that are living in Western Mass, and if I could take the view, well, if you wanted electricity, you should live in an area that's more densely populated. But if from the governor's perspective, if we're looking to try to grow Massachusetts across the regions, let's say that you are a company like Fidelity, and you're even willing to locate in a community. You're able to get broadband to your corporate locus, but your employees aren't going to locate there if they can't get broadband at their home. So it really is about trying to make sure that every region is open for business.
And just to be clear, I wasn't asking. I think there are some interesting cost-benefit questions. I wasn't asking that. I was saying, let's assume that. I'm curious about how the regulatory decisions are being made about who bears how much of the cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that remains an interesting question.
Stan, you mentioned that at some point that you may have to come in and mop up where in areas that maybe aren't economically viable to invest. What sort of timeline do you have where you're going to make that decision? Like, when do you want to see? When would be that point where you decide to go in? And then I have a follow-up question for Paul. Does that concern you to see now where the public sector is actually could maybe go in and serve as a service provider? I know that was one of the issues about the municipal broadband, where in a number of states, incumbent service providers tried to block that because they were concerned about the competitors coming in.
Mm-hmm. So on a temporal basis, by definition, it would be before 3 years because we need to have the mass broadband 1, 2, 3 networks built. We're reserving about 10 million of our allocation for that if necessary. The way that the state bond, there are literally billions and billions of dollars authorized by the legislature in bond money, but it doesn't really count unless it's a part of an administration's capital plan. So, we've got the 40 million built into a 5-year capital plan, and I'm very confident that, unlike a lot of the fiscal challenges on the operational side, the state budget is dealing with, the 40 million over that 5 years is secure. So I suspect it would probably be in years 4 and 5. And again, I think that we would be, ideally, we'd be working with last mile providers to make sure that the moment the mass broadband 1, 2, 3 network is online, last mile is connecting to it immediately, as opposed to waiting for this thing to build it and then they will come. That we are actively conditioning the market, and I don't think this thing is going to be built out and then someone's going to throw a switch and it all is lit at one time. So this is going to be coming on in phases, using that north-south axis for I-91, and I think that's where we're going to begin to see whether or not the incentives that we're providing is reducing enough the capital costs to allow a last mile provider to come in and make profit serving residences and businesses. And if you're Verizon, it may be someone else.
One of the lessons I think that could be learned from the municipal wireless struggle too is that the private sector initially thought that it was going to be a threat to their business model, but as time went on and they realized the vastness of internet access as an entity, they backed off. I mean, Verizon was probably the staunchest opponent in Pennsylvania when Philadelphia was trying to do it, but realized over time that it's not as much of a competitor to their model as they had originally thought. And so I think as we try to make this broadband thing available and more ubiquitous, that it should happen in tandem with the private sector as opposed to in competition, because again, I keep coming back to the public good or the greater good that this serves. And all you have to do is spend time in one of these countries that have the capacity that we would like to get to. And you realize how far we are behind, and how much of a benefit it is for the general public to be able to have that kind of access.
I think we had some particular concerns about the Philadelphia build-out, but we're, as a matter of principle, we're not against competing against the government or having the government compete against us. Just to give you an example, when we did our FiOS build-out, there are 3 communities in Massachusetts where we went in and got franchises where there was an existing municipal provider of cable service and internet. That's Braintree, Norwood, and Shrewsbury. So we don't go in saying, well, if the government's competing, then it's not fair and we can't go in. We went in with our eyes open in those 3 communities, knowing that there's already a government provider, in addition to a traditional cable company in those places. So, you know, whether we think a particular government investment or government business plan is good or not, we're not opposed to government competing, and we're not afraid to get in there with them and offer our services. You know, we are pretty proud of the networks that we have and the business plan that we've developed, and we think we can do pretty well.
And I would say Verizon's a partner in this in many ways, whether or not they want to be or not, or whether or not they ride the network or not. I mean, because as Jack well knows, and as Paul knows, I mean, the 35,000 poles we're going on, you know, they're almost all co-owned by Verizon and a utility. And so we're going to be working with them. Now, we're going to pay for access, and we're going to go through the same, but I don't think that they could point to many projects nationally where people are trying to access 35,000 poles within a 3-year time frame. And so we're working really closely hand in glove on a daily basis, where our technology folks will meet with their technology folks, our lawyers will meet with their lawyers, so that we can try to do this and do this in a way that's, you know, respectful of their role and respectful of our role going forward. So, you know, invite us back in 6 months and we'll tell you how that process is going.
One more question.
Yeah, I have a question. This is it seems to me a particularly dicey area for government to get into, where the technology is changing so fast. And for example, I think the FCC just released a whole lot of spectrum. Now maybe that's not going to be a direct competitor to the wireline, or to the broadband, but I would think it might give government some pause. If you're building something that you hope is going to be useful for decades, right? Well, in an area where it's changing so fast.
So the fiber, our technology advisors have done the models, and the fiber is actually advertised like over a 30-year life. I mean, it's a pretty durable asset. The electronics that Paul referred to.
People are using that technology, though.
But any technology people are using, if you're using wireless, if you're using 4G, you know, you may be getting it from your device, from wireless, but the data's not coming to that without we're going through fiber to a POP or to some sort of antenna. And so otherwise you get bottlenecks in the network. So, you know, it's all coming into a fiber at some point. There's not some sort of ubiquitous sort of, you know, wireless cloud that's hovering over the US or other. So, you know, one of the things that we do have to do is make sure that as part of our operating costs that we are able to build in what's called sort of a network refresh, because what makes these networks smart in terms of lighting them is the electronics around that, and that is something that's switched out, I think, probably every 3 to 5 years. But I'm pretty confident that and this is one of the reasons why the feds are investing in sort of middle mile fiber networks. They're steering people away from wireless technology, partly because that's a good way to spend a lot of money right now on something that might be obsolete in 5 years.
That's a good question. Yeah. Okay,
but I agree, it's a dicey area.
Yeah. All right. So, being sensitive to time, we want to thank our panelists. Stan and Paul, let's give them a round of applause. And we should continue to think about this issue and look out for editorials that talk about it. But particularly keep an eye on the Comcasts of the world, the Verizons of the world,
Google
Fiber. I mean, all these companies are driving this industry in a way that we've never seen before. So thank you all so much for coming. And when's the next?
Next one is, wait, before you go, also please sign our sign-up sheet.
Yes,
around somewhere.
Going around.
Yeah.
The next one is in January.
January. Okay.
January 25th. right
January
here.
25th. Okay, so everybody have a fantastic holiday if we don't see you, and thank you for participating.